Okay, well, I'm going to continue with the tradition of TEPSA by presenting the recommendations, although right now it's rather more for the record, but I think I'm still going to share our main ideas with you to also consider. And as Michael just said, we at least have the written part of the recommendations handed over to Mr. Schallenberg. Before I really start into the content side, I would want to highlight that the procedure of drafting the recommendation is a joint effort. So in general, that is coordinated by Patrick Kattochwil and Sabina Lange and myself. And these recommendations were now drafted and coordinated by Sabina Lange from IPA, with contributions from Nicoletta Pirozzi from the EIE, from Brendan Donnelly from the Federal Trust, from Mario Kölling and Ignacio Molina from the Royal Institute Elcano. Yes, and then Sabina Lange herself. I should also mention for the record that these recommendations not necessarily present the views of TEPSA as a whole, but rather those of the authors. I mean, having followed the presentation of Mr. Schallenberg and also the discussion, I had one thing came to my mind is that when we were considering about, the context and the challenges that this presidency will deal with, that is rather similar in some points with the consideration that were presented by Mr. Schallenberg. So first of all, of course, the EP elections and kind of the legislative pressure and the heightened political exposure linked to that, the Austrian presidency is facing. The second point that was also already mentioned is then some important negotiations. So it's not only the increase in terms of legislative workload, but there's actually two important negotiations coming up. And it's not only the Brexit that are about to be finalized, but it's also the beginning of the Multiannual Financial Framework, the MFF. And I think it's very interesting that that has not been mentioned so far. And so that is a challenge that we see. And then also, of course, the internal developments within the European Union. But here we also kind of focused more on the trends in the individual member states, and where you rather can observe some Eurosceptic populist trends in certain member states, and the latest example is just the elections in Italy. But then, of course, there is the question whether this seems to be a persisting trend of renationalization tendencies within member states, or whether, I mean, if you then look at Macron, the elections in France, or the elections in the Netherlands, so there might also be other forces at play. What we do know, however, is that the public opinion and the people's concerns is rather, or demand from policies to actually deal with the consequences of the two major crises that shook the European Union at its core recently, which is the financial and sovereign debt crisis and the migration crisis. So against this backdrop, we then, and within this context, we identified certain areas where we would want to present our recommendations to the Austrian presidency, and that is security, that is migration, that is the multi-annual financial framework, and finally the Brexit issue. So with regards to security, one major achievement within the area of security and defense was actually the conclusion of the permanent structured cooperation at the end of last year, and now it's in the phase of its implementation. So 27 member states have agreed or are part of the permanent structured cooperation, and there is already a certain list of so-called PESCO projects that need to be implemented. So just, for example, it's within the areas of military mobility or also training projects, so there are different areas that these projects deal with. So we would advise the Austrian presidency to actually focus on two things in light of these developments. And the first thing is actually to maintain an adequate level of political engagement. And this is really to motivate and keep the engagement of member states high, to increase the ability to plan, invest, and operate together. And for doing so, they should focus on connecting the implementation of PESCO projects or PESCO level with national European planning processes. A second thing that we advise them to do is actually to achieve and work towards synergies, creating synergies. And here there are two realms with regards to that. First of all, it's the capacity development. So that is then relating PESCO to the European Defence Fund, matching those two things. But there's also a second dimension to it, and that is actually the civilian CSDP. And here, the synergies need to be created between the different instruments laid out in the civilian capability development plan, and then with match that to the sources of funding, and also linking training and recruitment activities together. With regards to migration, and I'm glad to see that this is also one focus of the Austrian presidency. Here, we basically, and this might not be a new thing, but it's something that we should not forget. And we would encourage the presidency to basically go for a comprehensive management of migration. And what does this mean? This means that you have to look at the external dimension, and you also have to look at the internal dimension. And having, well, looked at the past developments since, well, the crisis in 2015, it seems rather clear that it's easier to find consensus within the external dimension rather than within the internal dimension of migration policy and asylum policy. So with regards to the external dimension, we really would encourage the presidency to follow the lines of third country cooperation, including return and readmission, and basically in line with the new partnership framework that should be promoted. The link between external and internal dimension is then basically the border controls, and here it is necessary to improve the information exchange and interoperability of IT systems in order to actually know who is crossing the borders and who's not. And then the internal dimension here, the biggest challenge is basically to promote greater solidarity among member states. And this would include EU-wide quota commitment. And here it is necessary to really discuss the different suggestions that are out there, either whether it's the Dublin reform or also considering the idea of linking quota commitment to well, structural funds and things like that. These are the crucial issues where there's little consensus among the member states, and this might be then actually the challenge with regards to this presidency. In terms of the the MFF, those negotiations are always generally challenging because the member states' positions differ on that. And if I understood Mr. Schallenberg correctly, he also kind of alluded to the fact that also within this, this negotiations, there is also the risk of having, you know, different classes of member states with this regard. The other challenge, and this is the particular challenge for this negotiation, is actually also the Brexit and the gap in financial means that the Brexit is actually causing. So here is also, in addition to having to find a balance between the member states' positions, it's also the question of how to balance this financial gap. And there you have two possibilities: either increasing contributions or cutting expenditures. We are aware of the fact that the Austrian presidency is not really in favor of increasing contributions, so we advise them to at least consider the modernization of the revenue side. In procedural terms, it would be necessary to ensure a swift and effective management of these negotiations. How can this be done? Of course, the first step would be to look at the Commission proposal and try to balance the member states' positions in view of this proposal to find a common ground. And also, it would be well advised to also include and regularly inform the European Parliament, and if possible, even invite the European Parliament to the informal meetings of the Council. Content-wise, I would just say that it's important to look for the growing challenges in policies and the added value of EU programs. And there should be found a balance between these two ambitions. Last point on the MFF, we fully endorse the Commission's proposal to link the future spending to the respect of rule of law and EU values. And we encourage the Austrian presidency to actually engage in a debate in order to find ways of reducing the financial support for those who lag behind with regards to the rule of law, and also discuss how financial incentives could be provided in order to comply with the rule of laws and the EU values. Last but not least, on the Brexit, I think the discussion here has already touched upon most of the points. So here it's only rather some general remarks. We expect the British withdrawal agreement to be concluded at the European Council in October 2018. Here are, again, some challenges implied. So first of all, we encourage the presidency to represent the negotiation mandate of the European Council, but at the same time also the political expectations of the European Parliament, as it will be the Parliament who needs to ratify also this agreement. The make or break of this deal is going to be the Irish land border. I think here this is something, a crucial point to discuss. And last but not least, the political declaration was already mentioned. And I think I would just want to add to this debate that this political declaration should be very clear on the point, and I think you can sum that up as no cherry picking allowed. Thank you very much.